At its peak, the British Empire controlled 13.7 million square miles of territory and ruled over 412 million people, roughly 1/4 of every human being alive on Earth. No empire in all of recorded history ever came close to that scale. Not Rome. Not the Mongols. Not anyone. So how did a small, rainy island off the northwest coast of Europe pull off the greatest territorial expansion in human history? The answer is not simply military power. It is not just superior technology. And it is certainly not luck. The real story involves a combination of financial engineering, strategic brutality, calculated diplomacy, and a series of decisions that reshaped every continent on the planet. One of those decisions, made by a private company rather than a government, changed the fate of over 1 billion people, and most history books skim right past it. In the next 10 minutes, you will learn exactly how Britain built this empire, which turning points mattered most, and why the methods used to hold it together were far more calculated and ruthless than the popular version of history tends to admit. To understand British expansion, you have to start where the empire truly began, not with soldiers, but with merchants. In 1600, Queen Elizabeth I granted a royal charter to the East India Company, a private trading firm given the legal right to conduct commerce in Asia. This was not yet an empire. It was a business. But that business came armed, and that changed everything. Throughout the 1600s, Britain competed fiercely with the Dutch and Portuguese for control of trade routes. The key resource at this stage was not land, it was access. Spices, textiles, and later tea generated extraordinary profits, and whoever controlled the sea lanes controlled the wealth. Britain won this competition through a combination of naval investment and a willingness to use violence where diplomacy failed. By the end of the Anglo-Dutch Wars in 1674, Britain had established dominance over the Atlantic trade routes and secured key footholds in the Americas, Africa, and India. The Americas became the first major theater of colonial expansion. Britain established colonies along the eastern seaboard of North America beginning in 1607 with Jamestown, Virginia. These colonies were economically extractive by design. Tobacco, cotton, and sugar drove the economy, and that economy ran on enslaved labor. Between 1640 and 1807, British ships transported an estimated 3.1 million enslaved Africans across the Atlantic, the largest forced migration in history up to that point. This is not a footnote. The wealth generated by slave labor financed much of the infrastructure, banking, and investment capital that later powered British industrial and military expansion. But here is what nobody talks about at the scale it deserves: the British government did not officially run most of this expansion in its early phase. Private companies, licensed by the Crown, conducted conquest and commerce simultaneously. They hired armies. They signed treaties. They administered territory. The empire was, for a significant portion of its history, a corporate project dressed in a national flag. The single most important example of this is the East India Company's conquest of India. In 1757, company forces under Robert Clive defeated the Nawab of Bengal at the Battle of Plassey. The battle lasted roughly 11 hours. Its outcome transferred control of Bengal, home to approximately 40 million people, into company hands. Within a decade, the company was collecting taxes from one of the most populated and economically productive regions on Earth. By 1803, British forces controlled Delhi itself. This matters because India became the economic engine of the entire empire. At the start of British rule, India accounted for roughly 25% of global GDP. By the time Britain left in 1947, that figure had fallen to under 4%. The extraction was systematic: raw materials shipped out, manufactured goods shipped back in, local industries deliberately suppressed. To protect British markets. The Industrial Revolution, which accelerated after 1760, gave Britain a decisive military and logistical advantage over almost every opponent it faced. Steam-powered warships, railways, telegraphs, and breech-loading rifles allowed small British forces to project power across vast distances with speed and lethality that pre-industrial armies could not match. In 1879, during the Anglo-Zulu War, a British force of roughly 1,700 men was defeated at Isandlwana, one of the most significant British military defeats in colonial history. But 6 months later, British forces had crushed Zulu resistance entirely. The industrial machine was simply too efficient to lose a prolonged campaign. Africa became the next major theatre after 1880. The Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885 is one of the most consequential and least discussed diplomatic events of the 19th century. European powers sat down in Berlin and divided the African continent among themselves. No African leaders were invited. No African consent was sought. Within 20 years, Britain alone controlled Egypt, Sudan, Nigeria, Kenya, Uganda, Rhodesia, South Africa, and numerous other territories. The continent was carved not along ethnic or cultural lines but along lines that served European administrative and economic convenience, borders that created conflicts still unresolved today. The methods used to hold these territories were not subtle. The British used collective punishment, forced labor, concentration camps, and deliberate famine as tools of control. During the Second Boer War from 1899 to 1902, British forces interned approximately 116,000 Boer civilians in concentration camps. An estimated 27,000 of them died, the majority children. This was not a side effect of war. It was a calculated strategy to break civilian support for the Boer guerrilla fighters. But here is the counterintuitive part: brute force alone never held the empire together. What actually sustained British control across such enormous distances was a far more sophisticated system. Britain mastered the art of indirect rule. Rather than replacing every local power structure, British administrators would identify existing leaders, kings, chiefs, or councils, and work through them. Those leaders retained their titles and local authority. In exchange, they enforced British policy, collected British taxes, and suppressed resistance on Britain's behalf. This approach required far fewer British soldiers and administrators, reduced the cost of occupation dramatically, and created local elites with a material interest in the empire's survival. This system was most visible in India, where Britain administered 300 million people with fewer than 1,000 senior British civil servants at any given time. The math only works if a significant portion of the local population is cooperating with or actively working for the colonial structure. And in India, in Africa, and across the Pacific, many were, because the empire offered them something in return, whether status, protection, trade access, or simply survival. The empire began to fracture after the First World War, which cost Britain 888,000 military deaths and left the country economically devastated. Maintaining global military presence became increasingly difficult to justify financially. The Great Depression of the 1930s made it worse. Then the Second World War finished the job. Britain entered 1939 as a global empire and exited 1945 as a power dependent on American loans to survive. The process of decolonization accelerated rapidly after 1945. India and Pakistan became independent in 1947. African and Caribbean colonies followed through the 1950s and 1960s. By 1997, with the handover of Hong Kong to China, the empire was effectively over. What remains is a question historians still debate. The British Empire brought railways, legal systems, and administrative structures to territories that retained them after independence. It also caused famines. The Bengal famine of 1943 killed an estimated 2 to 3 million people under circumstances where British policy choices directly worsened the death toll. It suppressed local industries, displaced populations, drew artificial borders, and extracted wealth on a scale that is difficult to fully quantify, but that economist Utsa Patnaik estimated at $45 trillion in modern terms drained from India alone over 200 years. The British Empire was not a force for civilization, and it was not simply a force for destruction. It was a system built to generate power and wealth for Britain, using every tool available: military, financial, diplomatic, and administrative. Understanding it clearly, without myth in either direction, is how we make sense of the world it left behind. Before you go, if you learned something new today, hit that like button right now. It genuinely helps this channel grow.